a lonely truck stop, a winter storm, and one decision that would change everything. When Linda Parker, a 55-year-old hauler, let a stranded Marine sleep in her rig, she thought it was just an act of kindness. But 7 days later, the Pentagon knocked on her door. What they revealed would leave her stunned. Would you have done the same? Snow whipped across the windshield like white knives in the dark. Linda Parker leaned forward in her seat, shoulders tight, squinting through the blur of flurries that the wipers barely managed to clear. Her Kenworth groaned against the wind, each gust rattling through the cab as if testing her patience. 40 years behind the wheel hadn't dulled her instincts, but nights like this reminded her how fragile even a heavy rig could feel when nature decided to roar. She had been running long enough to know the signs. Black ice under the thin crust of snow, the faint shimmer of headlights too close in her mirrors, the silence of the CB dead in the storm. She eased down on the throttle and spotted a truck stop glowing faintly ahead, one of those old highway diners that hadn't yet been swallowed by chains. The neon buzzed half dead above the entrance, but to her it looked like sanctuary. Linda parked carefully, the hiss of air brakes louder than the storm's howl, and sat for a moment with her hands on the wheel. She rubbed her temples. The freight in her trailer wasn't urgent, but the bills on her kitchen table back home were. Repairs, insurance, fuel, every mile was a calculation now, and she'd been losing ground. The Kenworth needed a new transmission soon, and her savings were thin as ice. She sighed, grabbed her coat, and stepped into the storm. Inside, the diner smelled of burnt coffee and fried onions, comfort in its own greasy way. Only a few travelers sat scattered among the booths. Linda slid into a seat near the window, ordered a black coffee, and let her hands thaw around the chipped mug. That's when she noticed him. A young Marine sat alone near the corner booth. His uniform was dusted with snow, his close-cropped hair damp as if he'd been walking in the storm. He wasn't eating, just staring at an empty plate, hands fidgeting on the table. His expression carried a weight Linda recognized, the look of someone stranded, holding back pride and fear in equal measure. When the waitress passed by, Linda leaned closer and asked quietly, "That kid order anything?" The waitress shook her head, said he lost his wallet. No phone either. Been sittin' here near an hour. Linda's gut tightened. She'd seen broke drivers before, but something about this boy's posture, the way his eyes stayed low, reminded her of her brother David, gone years now. He'd worn that same mix of defiance and exhaustion when he came back from deployment. Linda pushed back her booth seat, grabbed her mug, and walked over. "You look colder than my rig out there," she said, standing beside his table. The Marine looked up, startled. "Ma'am, sorry. I'll move if I'm in your way." "You're not in anyone's way. You eatin'?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No money. I'll be fine." Linda dropped into the seat across from him. "That's nonsense. A body can't fight weather like this on an empty stomach." She waved to the waitress. "Get him a burger, fries, and a refill. Put it on my tab." The Marine stiffened. "I can't let you do that." "You can and you will. Consider it a toll payment for sittin' in my booth." That cracked the corner of his mouth, the smallest ghost of a smile. "Thank you. I'm Private First Class Jeremy Cole. Was headed back to base before I lost my stuff." "Linda Parker, independent hauler. And you're telling me you're stuck in a truck stop 300 miles from base with no phone, no wallet, and no plan?" Jeremy nodded sheepishly. "Yes, ma'am." The waitress slid the plate onto the table, and Jeremy devoured the first bite like he hadn't eaten all day. Linda studied him between sips of coffee. He couldn't have been more than 20, maybe younger, with that fresh-faced look soldiers carried before the years carved them down. The kid didn't belong shivering in a truck stop with nowhere to turn. "You got anywhere to sleep?" Linda asked. He shook his head. "Then you're coming with me. My sleeper cab's warm enough. I'll run you to your base in the morning." Jeremy froze, fork halfway to his mouth. "Ma'am, I don't want to be a burden." Linda's voice hardened in the way truckers do when decisions are made. "Son, I've hauled heavier loads than you across worse roads. You're no burden. You're a passenger." For a moment, Silence sat heavy between them, broken only by the storm rattling the windows. Then Jeremy lowered his eyes and whispered, "Thank you." They left the diner together, trudging through knee-deep snow toward the Kenworth. Linda pulled open the cab door, gesturing him inside. He stepped into the sleeper, rubbing his hands together in disbelief. She handed him a spare blanket, then sat back behind the wheel, watching the storm paint white stripes across the windshield. For Linda, it felt like David was sitting there again, alive in some small way through this boy's presence. And though her bank account was on the edge and her truck groaned with age, she felt a steadiness she hadn't known in months. Maybe she couldn't fix her life in one night, but she could keep a Marine warm through the storm. That was enough. Dawn broke pale and heavy, the storm finally loosening its grip. The truck stop parking lot was layered in white, every rig and sedan buried like abandoned relics. Linda brushed the frost from her windshield with stiff hands, muttering about the cold biting deeper than it had in years. Behind her, Jeremy stood awkwardly in the snow, adjusting his borrowed blanket like a cape, waiting for direction. "Climb in," she called, pulling herself into the cab. "We've got a long ride and not much daylight." Jeremy obeyed without protest, sliding into the passenger seat. His breath fogged the glass as the heater hummed, slow to warm the icy cab. Linda set the Kenworth in motion, easing onto the highway where tire grooves cut faint paths through the drifts. The road stretched ahead, 300 miles of frozen asphalt between here and his base. For a while, they rode in silence, the drone of the engine filling the air. Jeremy sat stiff, hands clasped tight, staring straight ahead as if afraid to move. Linda glanced at him. "You always this quiet? Or is it the storm shutting you down?" He gave a half smile. "Guess I'm not used to strangers going out of their way. Feels strange." Linda snorted. "You think truckers are strangers? Spend long enough on the road and you realize every face is just another mile marker. We take care of our own. Out here, it's the only rule that matters." The miles passed slow. Snowbanks rose higher against the shoulders, and signs flashed warnings about ice ahead. At one curve, Linda's tires skidded, the trailer fishtailing just enough to send her heart thumping. She eased the wheel steady, but Jeremy had already braced his hands against the dash. "You okay?" he asked. "Fine. Old girl knows how to dance," she said, patting the dash. "But if you're offering to help, grab the chains from the back. Might need them if we hit the next pass." At the next turnout, she pulled over. Together they stomped through the snow, fitting the chains over the tires. Jeremy's fingers moved with precision, quick and sure. His face was red from the cold, but he didn't complain. "You've done this before," Linda observed. "Training sticks, even off duty," he answered, tightening the last hook. Linda studied him for a moment. Beneath the nervous exterior, there was steel. The boy wasn't just lost, he was carrying something heavy, the kind you couldn't see. Back on the road, Jeremy loosened up. The heater finally worked its magic, thawing the cab into a small cocoon against the white wilderness outside. He began talking, halting at first, then with the rhythm of someone who needed to be heard. He told her about enlisting straight out of high school, how he'd wanted purpose but hadn't realized how lonely the barracks could feel. About his mother back home in Illinois, worrying every night. About his father, a man who never quite understood why his son traded college for combat boots. Linda listened, hands steady on the wheel. She didn't interrupt, not even when his voice cracked. She let him speak until the silence returned. Then, in her gravelly way, she offered her own story. Life on the road, nights fighting fatigue, friends lost to accidents, the brother she'd buried in a flag-covered coffin. Jeremy turned toward her. He was a Marine too? David Parker. Served 2 tours, didn't come back from the second. I wasn't there when he needed me most, and I'll always carry that. Jeremy's jaw tightened, eyes glassing with something unspoken. I'm sorry. Don't be. Just means I keep my eyes open now, for anyone wearing the uniform. The highway stretched, mile after frozen mile, but the cab grew warmer with trust. Jeremy asked about trucking life, what it paid, how she handled loneliness, whether the road ever stopped feeling endless. Linda answered with blunt honesty. Sometimes it was brutal, sometimes it was freedom. By mid-afternoon, the clouds parted enough to cast pale sun over the snowbanks. Linda spotted the green sign ahead, Fort Brenton, 12 miles. She tapped the wheel. Looks like I'm about to lose my passenger. Jeremy straightened, suddenly anxious. I don't know how to thank you. Most people wouldn't have even stopped. Most people ain't me. You don't thank someone for doing what's right. You just pay it forward. They pulled up to the guarded gate of the base. Jeremy sat frozen for a second, staring at the barbed wire fence as if crossing it meant stepping back into a world he wasn't ready for. Linda gave him a nudge. Go on, Marine. Time to report in. He climbed down slowly, boots crunching the snow. Before shutting the door, he leaned back inside. I won't forget this. Ever. Linda nodded, her voice low. You better not. And keep your head down in there. Then he was gone, swallowed by the base guards and the heavy gates. Linda watched until he disappeared, then pulled her rig back onto the highway, empty now but for the echo of his words. 300 miles had passed beneath her wheels, but it felt like something larger had traveled between them. She didn't know if she'd ever see Jeremy Cole again. She only knew the road had carried more than freight this time. It had carried a bond. And somewhere deep inside, Linda felt purpose. The week that followed passed like so many others for Linda Parker. Long hauls, tight margins, and the hum of the Kenworth echoing through the empty highways. She had delivered her load, picked up another, and returned home to her modest house outside Wichita, a one-story place with a sagging porch she patched herself each spring. Her world, she thought, was back to its ordinary rhythm. But ordinary had never been stable. Bills stacked on the kitchen counter like little white tombstones. The repair shop left her another voicemail about the transmission, warning that the next trip could be her truck's last if she didn't replace it soon. Linda sat at the table one evening, a single lamp glowing above, balancing her checkbook with a pencil worn down to the nub. The numbers didn't add up. They rarely did anymore. She tried not to think about Jeremy Cole, the young Marine she'd dropped off at Fort Brenton. But his voice lingered. The way he had spoken about loneliness, about being invisible outside the uniform, it had carved a hollow space inside her chest. She caught herself staring at the phone, half expecting a call that would never come. Instead, the knock came at the door. Firm, measured, the kind that didn't belong to neighbors or delivery men. Linda set her pencil down slowly. A cold ripple moved up her spine. She pulled the door open and found two men standing on her porch. They wore dress uniforms, pressed sharp, the kind she remembered from her brother's funeral. Their shoes shone even in the dirt of her walkway. One was tall, silver-haired, his chest heavy with ribbons. The other, younger, carried a briefcase. Miss Parker? The older one asked. Her throat tightened. That's me. May we come in? The kitchen suddenly felt too small with them inside. Linda poured coffee out of instinct, sliding chipped mugs across the table. The older officer introduced himself as Colonel Harris, the younger as Captain Lee. They didn't touch the coffee. We're here regarding Private First Class Jeremy Cole, Harris began. At the name, Linda's hand froze around her mug. Is he? He's alive, Harris interrupted quickly. No cause for alarm. In fact, it's quite the opposite. You assisted him last week during a severe storm. Linda nodded slowly, gave him a lift. Seemed the right thing to do. Harris exchanged a glance with Lee before leaning forward. Ms. Parker, Jeremy Cole is the son of General Marcus Cole. You may recognize the name Joint Chiefs, 3 tours overseas. The name landed heavy. Linda had seen it in headlines, linked with decisions that shaped entire wars. She blinked, trying to process. You're telling me that boy? Yes, and your actions, while humble, sparked serious questions at the Pentagon. How does the son of a high-ranking general end up stranded without support? What does that say about how we treat our service members in transit? Linda let out a bitter laugh. Says what I've seen my whole life. People fall through the cracks. Nobody notices until it's their kid. Lee opened his briefcase, pulling out a thin folder. The Department of Defense has authorized a review of veteran and active duty transport protocols. General Cole himself requested that you be brought in as a civilian consultant. He believes your experience in logistics could offer a perspective we're missing. Linda stared at them, stunned. Me? I'm a trucker with overdue bills and an engine that's about to die. You think the Pentagon needs my 2 cents? Harris's voice was steady. Not needs. Demands. You've spent decades navigating supply lines this country depends on. You see what systems forget. That's why you're on our list. Her stomach churned. It felt absurd. Last week she was chaining tires with a stranded Marine. Now she was being asked to advise generals. She tried to find footing in the absurdity. And if I say no? Harris gave a thin smile. General Cole isn't a man used to hearing no. Besides, this isn't just an invitation. It's a recognition. We want to fly you to Washington by week's end. Silence pressed heavy in the kitchen. Linda glanced at the counter stacked with unpaid bills, at the grease-stained ledger that measured her life in negative numbers. Washington, D.C., a world she'd only ever seen on television. She felt the edges of imposter syndrome bite hard. I'm no politician, she muttered. We're not asking for politics, Harris replied. We're asking for honesty. You gave that to Jeremy Cole. Now we need it at a larger scale. The officers stood, straightening their jackets, leaving a business card on the table. A driver will collect you Friday morning. Pack light. When the door shut behind them, Linda sat alone in the silence, staring at the card. Pentagon seal embossed gold. Her name scrawled beneath in block letters. She pressed her hands to her face, whispering to herself, "What in God's name have I gotten into?" But somewhere beneath the fear, a flicker of pride glowed. Not for herself, but for David, her brother, whose memory had guided her to open her cab that night. She thought of Jeremy too, and the promise in his eyes as he walked back through those base gates. Linda Parker had always believed her life would begin and end on the road. Now the road had delivered her to a door she never expected to open, and Washington was waiting. Linda Parker had been to plenty of cities in her years on the road: Dallas, Chicago, Denver, but Washington felt like another planet. The skyline was sharp with marble and glass, streets crawling with security checkpoints and men in suits moving briskly as if every second was billable. Her trucker boots clacked against polished floors as she followed an escort into the Pentagon, feeling as though each step marked her as an intruder. She carried one small duffel bag, the same she'd packed for cross-country runs. No tailored dress, no polished heels, just her worn jeans, a flannel shirt, and the leather jacket that had weathered 1,000 miles of storms. She could feel the glances from passers-by, a mix of curiosity and skepticism. "Ms. Parker?" a voice called. A young officer with crisp posture introduced himself as Major Klein, assigned to guide her through the day. He spoke in clipped sentences as he ushered her down long corridors where military history stared from framed photographs. Linda kept her head high, even as nerves rattled beneath her skin. The first meeting room looked like something out of a film. Long table, flags in each corner, rows of brass and civilians with polished notebooks. At the head sat General Marcus Cole, a man whose reputation Linda knew but whose presence startled her. His uniform bore more weight than she thought cloth could carry, his gaze steady and heavy with command. When she entered, the room quieted. General Cole stood. "Ms. Parker, thank you for being here." Linda shifted awkwardly. "Not sure what you expect me to add, sir. I'm just a driver." The general's jaw twitched with something close to a smile. "Sometimes the clearest truths come from the road, not the office. Please sit." For hours, Linda listened. They spoke in acronyms and polished reports about transport failures, logistical oversight, and protocol inefficiencies. None of it sounded human. When the discussion stalled on budget constraints, Linda finally raised her hand. "Begging your pardon, but you're talking like cargo moves itself. Out there, it's men and women. You leave them stranded with no wallet or backup plan, you're gambling with lives. I've run supply chains across blizzards and deserts. You don't plan for perfect conditions. You plan for breakdowns, for missed signals, for the one guy stuck without a ride. That's where your system cracks. The room went silent. Some bristled. Others leaned forward. The general watched her closely. "Go on," he said. Linda swallowed, then pressed on. She told them about the codes truckers lived by, how convoys protected one another, how rest stops became lifelines, how a single breakdown could ripple across 1,000 miles if no one stepped in. She compared it to soldiers in transit, young like Jeremy, left invisible between assignments. You want efficiency? Respect the human element. You shore up the weak points before they become disasters. By the time she stopped, her palms were damp, her voice rough. She half expected laughter. Instead, the general nodded. Slowly, others followed. Notes were scribbled, heads bent in agreement. Major Klein leaned toward her as the meeting broke. "You realize you just rewrote half their agenda." Linda exhaled, shoulders trembling. "I just told them the truth." The next day, she was led into a hall she hadn't even known existed, lined with flags and echoing with footsteps. A small ceremony had been arranged. Soldiers in dress uniforms stood at attention, rows of polished brass filling the seats. General Cole approached the podium. "My son came home safely last week," he began, voice resonant. "Not because of military precision, not because of protocols, but because a woman saw a Marine in need and gave him shelter in her cab. That act of kindness revealed something we too often forget, that logistics is not just numbers and trucks, but people." He turned to Linda, his stern face softening. "Linda Parker, on behalf of the United States Armed Forces, we thank you, not only for what you did for my son, but for reminding us of what service really means." Applause filled the chamber. Linda stood awkwardly, hands fumbling at her sides, cheeks hot. She wasn't used to eyes on her. Yet as she met the general's gaze, she felt a quiet strength steady her. Afterward, as people filed out, a call came through to her borrowed phone. She stepped aside to answer. Jeremy's voice came over the line, thin but certain. "Ms. Parker? It's me. I wanted you to know I made it back with my unit. And I wanted to say, you gave me hope when I didn't have any. Thank you." Her throat tightened. "Keep that hope, son. It'll take you farther than you think." When the line clicked dead, Linda slipped the phone into her pocket. She looked down at her scuffed boots against the marble floor, the same boots that had walked frozen truck stops and fuel-stained lots. She was still a hauler, still broke, still uncertain about tomorrow. But she didn't feel small. The road had carried her here, not just to Washington, but to a place where her voice mattered. And as she prepared to head back home, she realized something. Purpose wasn't always in the miles you logged. Sometimes it was in the lives you carried along the way. This story reminds us that the smallest choices can ripple into history. Linda thought she was just offering a place to rest, yet she set off a chain reaction that reached the Pentagon. What would you have done in her place? Share your thoughts below. And if this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to embrace the journey for more powerful stories like this. See you in the next video.